Good evening. We're going to get started here in about 1 minute. If you can grab some food, grab some drink, and take a seat. Thank you.
I think they are, but my vision of that, well, they're going to pick on me because I'm a retail developer. My vision of this is it's got to be some convenience accessory type of, because unfortunately we don't have enough frontage along the main arterial. You got all in Northfield. Well, yeah, it's people. It's so much.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. I am Brittany Morris-Saunders. I am the Director of Economic Development for Commerce City, and I'm so glad that you are taking time out of your busy evenings to join us tonight. This should be a real treat for the political nerd like myself. Our topic tonight is urban renewal. With the recent purchase of the Mile High Greyhound Park, urban renewal is a hot topic for Commerce City. As a member of the ICSC, International Council of Shopping Centers Alliance, Commerce City was given the opportunity to tap into the expert resources of the International Council of Shopping Centers for an in-depth focused discussion on urban renewal. The ICSC Alliance program promotes public-private partnerships and works to enhance communication between the public and private sector on emerging issues that impact the retail real estate industry and the quality of lives of local communities. The Alliance program is a special ICSC initiative which provides forums for public and private sectors to network, share ideas, discuss industry issues, and explore retail development opportunities. I'd like to recognize today a few people. First and foremost, we will start with our city council members in the audience. And Julie, if you wouldn't mind just turning up the lights for a moment. I will start with Renee Bullock. He is one of our council member at large. Yay. We have council member Jim Benson in the back. He represents Ward 2. We have Mayor Pro Tem Dominic Moreno in the back. We have Steve Douglas, council member at large in the back. Councilman Rick Teeter, who represents Ward 4. And Councilmember Crystal Elliott, who represents at large. Thank you for being here this evening. I also want to introduce some representatives from our city staff in the audience. We have Roger Tinklenberg, the finance director. We have Jim Hayes, our community development director. Greg Clements, our Public Works Director, and Chris Kramer, our Planning Manager. Thank you all for being here as well. And then last but not least, I would like to recognize the members of the ICS Colorado-Wyoming Alliance who are with us today. If you could please stand. I'd also like to thank First Bank for providing tonight's refreshments. Please drink and eat during the event or after. We are honored to host a very distinguished panel of experts this evening who combined have over 100 years of urban renewal experience and have worked on over 175 projects across the country. The panel is made up of experts in development, legislation, economics, city staff, and elected officials. Between the 5 of them, we will have an opportunity to examine urban renewal from all possible angles. To lead our discussion tonight, it is my honor to introduce our moderator for the panel. Mark Goldberg has more than 30 years' experience in real estate development, selecting sites, acquiring land, supervising design and construction, leasing, and brokerage and property management. Mr. Goldberg is president of Goldberg Properties, a real estate development, investment, and asset management firm. Goldberg Properties' principal focus is retail real estate. Mr. Goldberg's relationships with top retailers such as King Soopers, Walmart, Home Depot, Costco, and Lowe's have led many shopping center developments in the Rocky Mountain region, anchored by these and other nationally recognized merchants. Goldberg Properties has worked effectively in public-private partnerships in the development of retail projects in blighted urban and suburban situations. Goldberg has also been a court-appointed receiver and worked-out developer for lending institutions in several distressed real estate projects. Goldberg has served in leadership roles in the International Council of Shopping Centers, served 2 terms as director of the Rocky Mountain region, and as Western Division Government Affairs Chairman for ICSC. Mr. Goldberg has taught a class at the University of Colorado Graduate School in Real Estate Development and is a member of the CU Real Estate Council and on CUREC Executive Committee. Goldberg's hands-on approach to managing the firm's portfolio has earned the confidence of clients as well as the respect of government officials who are playing an increasingly important role in improving and financing developments. I want to personally thank Mark Goldberg for his leadership in the Commerce City Urban Renewal Authority's purchase of the Mile High Greyhound Park. And with that, I will introduce Mark Goldberg.
Well, good evening, everyone. Tonight you're going to get a really a front-to-back course in urban renewal. Sometimes a lot of mystery around urban renewal, but it is probably the single most effective tool that the development community and cities and municipalities have to undertake real estate development and public-private partnerships and really, as one of our panelists talked about last week, really undertake the much-needed task of community development. Let me introduce you to our distinguished panel. To my immediate right is Greg Moran. Greg is the Director of Development for the Western Region for MVG Development Company. Greg has spent over 26 years in the real estate development business. Prior to being with MVG, he was with Miller Weingarten Development, which is a retail developer in Colorado. And at Miller Weingarten, Greg was involved in the City Center Inglewood project. Many of you may remember that as the old Cinderella City project, and has Walmart. It's a mixed-use development and one of the first mixed-use projects in Colorado, and certainly one of the more effective public-private partnerships, taking a blighted mall to full development. Other projects include the Aurora City Place, Thornton Crossing, Gardens of Havana, and River Point on Sheridan. Currently, Greg is involved with MVG, and he is moving around the country. We were talking earlier, developing smaller projects with what's known as build-to-suits for 7-Eleven, Applebee's, and other smaller tenants, and that's his specialty these days. Greg has served as in some of the same roles I did with ICSC as the state director in the Western States, Director for Governmental Affairs, and has been involved in our real estate community for many, many years. Greg has a BA from University of Denver.
I do.
That's right, so he's a Denver guy. To Greg's right is Ann Richter. Ann is the principal owner of Richter Cunningham, and Ann is the premier person that communities go to in working with the development community and analyzing public-private partnerships and urban renewal projects. There's hardly, and I went through this earlier, I don't think there's a city on the Front Range, that alone, on the western part of the state, and other cities and states around the west that you haven't worked with. So it would be too numerous to cite, but it includes over 500 assignments working for cities and developers, and over $1.5 billion in investment in the public-private partnership and using urban renewal. Ann has been at it for 20 years. Prior to the company being formed as Richter and Cunningham, it was formerly known as Leland Cunningham, and then before that, Ann was with Leventhal Horwath, the National Real Estate Advisory Company. To Ann's right is Dan Minzer. Dan is a lawyer in Denver and has worn both the hats as a lawyer and practicing for developers, and Dan has also been a developer in his long career. 18 years as a lawyer at Ott & Johnson, over 26 years of experience. Dan was instrumental in many facets of the development of the Belmar Shopping Center in southwest part of the Metroplex in Lakewood, Colorado. At the Belmar project has a lot of distinguished features to it. It is over $225 million in construction. It was a $750 million overall development project. 200,000 square feet of office, 700,000 square feet of retail, and on and on. Dan has also been one of the go-to people as the urban renewal laws get kind of vetted through the legislature. Dan has been one of the authors of that law and some of the recent revisions to it to make sure that the urban renewal laws, which is one of the few tools that we have, stay sharp and not get watered down. To Dan's right is Susan Grafton. Susan's the Economic Development Director for the City of Westminster, a role she has been in over 20 years now. And Susan is really one of the key people that I think we can point to in our metropolitan area as a job creator. And Susan has done that through her role as the Economic Development Director for the City of Westminster. She has been responsible for over 3,000 licensed businesses, 4 office parks, 4 million square feet of new and diverse retail. Currently, Ann is working on the 100-acre Westminster Mall project that is in the redevelopment mode through an urban renewal process. And to Ann's right, or to Susan's right, I'm sorry, is Davis Reinhardt. Davis has also a dual role that he has played. He has been the principal developer for the Lowry Development Authority, and he is currently a city councilman in the city of Wheatridge and former mayor pro tem. And Davis was with Lowry from 1996 to 2004 and really oversaw that completed project. So now that you know our audience, our panel a little bit, let us kind of get to know you just briefly. How many folks are involved in the business community in Commerce City that are here? And how many folks are residents and those of you are from the sort of the north side of Commerce City? And those of you are from the southern part around near the dog track? Okay. Let's get into it. We're going to ask some questions, and the way this is going to go, one of the folks will respond to the question. There'll be some interplay, and I think throughout the process of this, you'll really get to know what urban renewal is all about. So, Susan, let's start with you.
Okay.
Can you give us some of the definitions, some of the acronyms and some of the definitions that are used in urban renewal, and the economic tools that are used, and what blight means, and some of those things? And can you give us some examples how urban renewal has been used in some of the projects that you've been involved with in Westminster?
Okay, I will start with some of them. You use the word tool, and when I think of urban renewal, I think of it as simply one of the many tools that we have to use in doing development at the municipal level. It's something that a lot of people feel is kind of scary, but when you look at it, its primary purpose is to do 2 things for a local government, and that would be to assemble land or properties. The other is to help you in financing the project long term. There are requirements for putting property into urban renewal. It needs to meet goals and objectives and things like that. But the primary purpose of it is to give you the tool to finance a project that wouldn't otherwise happen without some assistance or the guidance of the local government. The assembly of land allows you to acquire property, and if necessary, the big C comes up, and that being condemnation. It is one of the things that's part of urban renewal, but most of us can go through projects with just very minor use of condemnation, more for cleanup activity, to clean up old leases or things like that. But it is one of the things that is out there. You mentioned blight. The term for blight, I don't know. I'd let somebody else here, Ann or Dan, can define that. But I will tell you, it is a required term that we have to meet to be able to designate an area as part of an urban renewal area. And I've had a number of property owners come to me and say, but my property is not blighted, or it's not awful, it doesn't look like the ghetto. And it's like, yes, I agree, it doesn't. And if you look at the state statute says it doesn't have to look like a ghetto to be described blighted. There are clear standards that we have to follow, and one of those is that we designate an area as blight as defined by the statute, and I'll let you guys define that. So that's the blight thing. What else?
Well, let's maybe talk about maybe Greg could fill in here a little bit. There are often a lot of tools that have acronyms like TIF, Tax Increment Financing, and PIF, Public Improvement Fee.
Fees.
And how developers use those and communities use those, as well as the ad valorem taxes. Can you give us some insight, Greg, how that's worked in your history and development, and what those tools really mean?
Sure. First off, thank you for coming tonight. We really appreciate you being here tonight. You start getting into these acronyms of TIF and PIF and special districts and special assessments that you can use for tools. I mean, there's so many projects that you look at in this city that would not have occurred without these tools. Tax increment financing is really a way to skin the cat to bring dollars back into the project for the developer, for the city, that creates an opportunity to redevelop where you wouldn't be able to otherwise. You share that tax increment that is created as a result of your development. In my experience, it's all retail, so it's what drives Colorado and our retail sales tax is the economy of that. But more than anything else, is the TIF is that we're sharing some of the tax dollars that we bring in the door.
Sales tax dollars.
Sales tax dollars, yes. Well, thank you. And then it's also, in many ways, there's also property tax increment as a result of increasing property taxes, as a result of creating an urban renewal authority on a blighted area that's not creating its highest and best use. Tax increment financing, and we can get into all these details later, but it's taking the existing tax revenue and sharing that revenue. It's not an additional tax. It is truly taking, if you had your 3% tax that comes into the city of Commerce City, then you would share part of that, and it's a negotiation that occurs when you're doing your development. Public improvement fees are different. The PIF is an add-on tax that is very well noted. I've had a number of projects that we've done it, anywhere from as small as a quarter of a percent per dollar up to a full percent. And that is an add-on tax that is used strictly for public improvements. And that could be roads, it could be bridges, it could be right-of-ways, it could be parks, it could be golf courses, it could be a lot of different things. And it's all up to the individual cities and how that works. But again, those are items.
How does the consumer pay the public private investment?
The public improvement fund is paid when you purchase an item. And there are many examples of this around the community today, where you will go buy something, and on the back of the cash register, as you're writing your check, or not writing a check today, but using your debit card, they have a sign up there that says this is a district that it charges a 0.5% public improvement fund or fee that it was for improvements of this property. So you would be paying 0.5% more sales tax for improvements that were done in that area. And it may not have been anything that had to do directly with the shopping center itself, but it might have been something to get that shopping center to occur. It had to improve that 6-lane road. It had to redo that culvert that was draining out onto the road every other day. So that's where the public does end up paying an add-on tax, that public improvement fee. You can get into special districts and where you would actually have add-on mill levies for additional improvements. All these are tools, though, that are very important when you start talking about redevelopment. Somebody talks about, they talked about urban renewal and blight, slippery slope as to what people determine those things to be. But truly, even if a property is not blighted, but it's sitting adjacent to an urban renewal authority, because something's blighted across the street doesn't make it a bad thing. What it does is it gives us all an opportunity to create something new and exciting that will hopefully bring the property that's kind of wavering on next to the bad stuff into a better world. I mean, there's good examples of what we've done. You mentioned one of our projects, Aurora City Place, 65-acre project down at 225 in Alameda. Had sat there for years and years, and finally the city of Aurora took up on themselves to spend the money to put in the interchange, which the state could not afford. They came up with the $20 million, floated the bonds, and made it happen because Aurora Mall had languished because a long time ago, the city and the developer couldn't get along. So they put in the new interchange, we go develop a 65-acre project, and in turn, Simon, who owns the mall, turns around and invests $100 million in the redevelopment of that mall, which in turn creates an opportunity for the city of Aurora to relocate their offices and create this beautiful office park, which in turn created an opportunity for Arapahoe County to move across the street and build another new building. All of that, which never of that would have occurred had we not started with the process of the city of Aurora having enough idea and vision to create a small urban renewal authority that created prosperity for the rest of the inner area.
Dan, have you used TIF and PIF in a lot of your projects?
We have, and actually I wanted to clarify one of the things that Greg said. Actually, the TIF, the tax increment from dancing, it's literally the increase. It's the increment above what the taxes are.
So what sets the base if it's the increment?
It's basically what the sales taxes are and the property taxes are at the time you create the urban renewal area.
So in the case of the dog track here in Commerce City, that basis would be negligible or zero.
Yeah, the sales tax I suspect would be fairly low.
Low.
The property tax is whatever the property's valued at the time. But it's only the increase in sales tax and property tax that's generated solely as a function of the project that's available to be reinvested in the project. The other thing I think to keep in mind is that those tax revenues can only be spent on a limited universe of expenses. They can be
How
spent
about developers' profit? Is that one of the places that can be spent?
Sadly, no. I might work on that.
I would argue that that's a witch pocket it in some days.
I mean, but as a practical matter, I mean, in most cases, that's the only thing, well, frankly, in all cases, urban renewal, and we're using TIF financing, that's the only thing that allows the project to go forward. I mean, at Belmar, for example, the infrastructure costs were $180 million. So that's for putting in new roads, new utility systems, $60 million worth of parking structures that are free. So you're not getting anybody to pay rent, or you go in there, you're not paying $1 to park for an hour or whatever. So they're not revenue generating at all. The only way to fund those improvements, you can't charge high enough rent to pay for those improvements. And frankly, the only way to do that is to reinvest the increase in tax revenues. So at Belmar, for example, we used both the tax increment financing and a public improvement fee. The mall had started in the early 60s. It had basically gotten to the end of its physical and economic useful life. They had actually worked consensually with all the tenants and landowners for about 10 years to try to figure out a way to redevelop it. There had been a lot of contemplation and discussion about a new mall that was going to be built where Colorado Mills ended up getting built. Right. And so there was a lot of discussion by the developer it was going to build there, trying to woo the department stores over there. And so that created this uncertainty and indecision. And so the mall continued to languish for another 10 years. And so nothing would happen. In fact, we ended up buying, when I was a partner of Continuum, we ended up buying the land that was Villa Italia Mall. The land was actually leased to an insurance company, and the insurance company owned the buildings. We ended up negotiating a contract to buy the buildings from the insurance company. So we essentially owned everything, but there were tenants there. But we didn't have the ability to terminate those leases. And actually in Christmas of 2000, unrelated to anything we were doing, but more a function of what else was happening in the economy, 3 out of the 4 department stores announced they were closing. Montgomery Ward's filed bankruptcy, Penny's closed, Dillard's closed, and there was Foley's. And all of the small shop tenants, or a large percentage of them, said, well, if they're not department stores here, this isn't economically viable, we're leaving. And so it was fortuitous that we'd started that process ahead of that, because it basically went from, a dying mall to a dead mall literally almost overnight. And the only way...
If you have a dying mall, you want it to be a dead mall quick.
You do, you don't
You want an early death.
It's sort of like the, you know, Monty Python and the Holy Grail, where they're bringing the cart along and bring out your dead and banging the drum and say you're not quite dead yet and smack you in the head.
Davis, you had a thought on TIF and PIFs and
Yeah, I just wanted to say that you know, communities that want to invest presumably in changing their project have a lot more limited opportunities now than they would have a generation ago. And missed in the introduction is by training, I'm a construction engineer and I build infrastructure and so forth. But if you look back at the way public improvements, if you make the presumption that there are public improvements necessary to get a change you want, it was possible a generation ago, in fact, it was the norm for the community to be able to invest capital dollars on their own. Now, both by custom and by law in this state now, it's almost impossible for a community, even if it's an incredible both long-term financial benefit and a benefit to the community in any other way. There's almost no way a city like Wheat Ridge, where I sit on the council, can wake up in the morning and say, hey, this is a $10 million investment we'd like to make because it's going to get us $40 million, you know, 5 years from now, or even if it's a tremendous return. We don't have the tool. This is the only tool that we have to make that capital investment once we've decided it's to the benefit of the community. So, you know, the whole talk here, the whole discussion is about how this can benefit both parties and why it's a useful and positive tool for the community to invest in itself in whatever it decides to do.
I would just say, I mean, there's basically two essential tools to urban renewal. I mean, as Susan indicated, there's the ability to help acquire property, ultimately through the use of eminent domain, if that's necessary, or at least the threat of it, and the economic development tools, the economic tools. I mean, and frankly, we had to use both of those to do Belmar. I mean, I think the sort of...
Can we say that those are financial tools as opposed to economic development tools?
Yeah, they are financial tools. They're financing tools.
Yes.
Because you basically take that tax revenue and you use those to help fund some of those infrastructure costs. But even though we own the land, we own the buildings, you know, I think the sort of assumption in the community is that, you know, developers are wealthy and they have all this power and they can sort of dictate to the tenants what happens. The reality is, it's just the opposite. I mean, the large retailers have all the power. Just a couple of brief examples. When we went to go talk to a large department store chain, to be unnamed.
Not to be named.
To be named later, to talk about our plans for the redevelopment and to kind of work with them and try to figure out how we could make them part of the development. We introduced ourselves, we went to their headquarters and introduced themselves, started to describe to them what our plan was, and they said, well, let us explain to you how the shopping center world works. You're gonna give us the land, you're gonna write us a check for $18 million, and we'll consider paying you 25 cents a square foot in rent. I said, well, that's not gonna work very well. You know, we don't have a lot of money just sitting around to write you a check. And, you know, that would have made the project completely economically unviable. And frankly, it was only the ability that condemnation gave us to terminate their lease. Now, they were entitled to get whatever the fair value was, the economic value of that lease in the condemnation process. And so we went through a year's process to do that. The other peculiar situation we had, a large national bank, also not to be named, was one of our principal construction lenders. It was a $140 million construction loan. And so we were in the condemnation process because we had to use that to terminate the leases that we couldn't otherwise negotiate a termination of. So the real estate lending folks at this large national bank were telling us that we had to get the condemnation process complete before they would lend us the money. That same bank happened to have a branch at the old Villa Italia Mall.
so they just rolled over then.
Oh yeah, completely. They said, what can we do for you? Not. Actually, the local folks sued us in a separate lawsuit in addition to the condemnation lawsuit, trying to stop the condemnation and trying to stop the project, while the people in the real estate lending group were trying to loan us $140 million to do the project and telling us we had to get rid of it, that lawsuit. We said, well, that's you. Can't you get rid of it? It's you. They said, no, those are other people in the bank. We can't deal with them. So, I mean, and frankly, those are, as silly as that sounds, I mean, those are literally the sorts of circumstances you're faced with where you don't have the power and leverage. You're at somebody else's mercy. And even if it's somebody who wants you to do what you're trying to do, there are other people literally in that organization telling you, don't do it, we're trying to stop you. And so, you know, I think sort of the conventional thought about condemnation is it's sort of the government, doing bad things to little people. And I don't think
I
that's...
think it's usually the developer tied to that.
Yeah.
The city somehow pushes us out in front and says, hey, look what he's doing. Isn't this great? I'll stand up and take it. I mean, we went through the same experience at Buckingham, but we had a favorable ownership there. But it's the same type of thing. Getting back to this condemnation, I have a really interesting example. We went through the process of, and just so you understand, if we are going to even utter the C word, which a lot of the municipalities won't even talk about today because it's so ugly as a result of Connecticut. The issue really comes down to using it as a tool to make sure people understand that everybody's serious, because you end up with the best efforts on the developer and the city side to cooperatively make a real deal with the owners that are there. You're trying to buy this land at fair market value. Now, unfortunately, everybody got the same memo back in 2003 and 4 and 5 that their land was going up by 15% a year. Guess what? The memo's changed, and we've got a different one today. But the issue is that when you're negotiating with these people, you're trying to be reasonable, you're trying to show them fair market value, and then inevitably you end up with 90% of the project being realistic. And then there's that 10%, and that's where the tools come into play. It's not that you're going to go out and blanket the whole thing and say, we're condemning 85 acres because that's what we do.
Never happens. No.
Well, it probably does in certain areas. But I think the intention, I think what people need to understand is it's generally of everybody's best interests to try and make fair market deals with everybody that's there today.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Let's
and
let's
I would-
talk
I
into
would
some
say-
limitations. Let's kind of move on to some other parts of the tools. And everybody hears about Tabor and the effects of that, but where did Tabor and urban renewal meet or butt heads, and how does one work with some of those issues?
First, I have to say, I can't believe that the word condemnation came up in the first 5 minutes. I thought for sure in the last hour, but not in the first 5 minutes. So that was interesting. And Mark knows I'm totally out of control, and to that point, I have to come back to blight real fast because we have so many residents here. I want to say one more thing about blight. It is a statutory definition. It is not intended to be an insult to any individual property owner. And one thing that I often say is that there are 11 factors of blight identified in the state statute. And when you read them, you can say they're a little bit vague, and in some ways they are. And that, I think, actually in my practice in different communities does serve. I think it still is a good statute. But the point I'll make is that many people often ask me, how can you find blight on vacant land? And it's the most obvious question in the world, but if you look at the 11 factors, 7 of the 11 have nothing to do with whether there's an existing building on the site. And one example might be if you have a road in front of your home or your business, and let's say there's a frequent number of accidents there. And when I do a blight study, I'll go out and I will attach a factor to that road right in front of your property.
I mean, a good example would be right here where the dog track has a highway that does need access, and arguably that access prevents development.
But that won't offend anybody. But if you're a resident and somebody attaches blight to the road in front of your house, somehow that feels very personal. And I always say, I'm going to attach it right where the accidents happen, because I want, when the city comes back, when the Urban Renewal Authority comes back and says, what conditions of blight do we have to fix? I want them to fix the condition in front of my house or my business. So I want it attached. So it's not an indictment of your property. It's calling attention to these negative conditions that affect you whether you elect to improve your property or not. So just kind of think of it that way, that it's not an indictment. It's trying to draw attention to the areas that need to be fixed. And whether you own property across the street or not, that could end up being a good thing for you and should end up. So that's that. And then on Tabor, the thing I'll say, and I caveat this with the fact that I am a person who has never run for public office, never intends to run for public office. I have the utmost respect for the people that do. God bless them, because I think it's one of the hardest jobs you would ever choose to do. So I caveat this, but I've often said that if I was a city manager or a mayor, that I would literally make my entire city an urban renewal area, because it's not subject to Tabor. And, you know, that sounds really good in theory and that, but seriously, it is an interesting way to get around it. And Tabor, for any of you who don't know, was passed, I think, in 1992. I would, showing you my bias, say that many of the voters in the state, some absolutely out of clear conscience knew what it was and said, yes, that's what they wanted, and that's absolutely fine. And others, I think, were kind of got a puppy they didn't want after it was said and done. And urban renewal is not subject to Tabor, and Tabor basically caps the revenue that a city can grow by. It ties it to population growth and inflation, and it says you will never grow beyond that point. So if you have great years, it puts a cap on that, so you can't develop these reserves, I guess, for the bad years. Whatever, that's what we live with, but urban renewal actually lives outside of Tabor. It's not subject to it. And there's three cities in the state that essentially have made their entire cities urban renewal areas, and so.
Bit controversial.
Absolutely controversial.
Dan will talk about that
Absolutely.
in a bit. But. So Davis, Lowry was probably one of the most high-profile projects that we've seen in our state. And I wonder if you could give us a little background how it came about, and also what were some of the tools that were used at Lowry in an urban renewal context.
Great, thanks. I talk all day long about Lowry, because it was a tremendous opportunity for me personally, and the opportunity to see a real redevelopment from scratch move forward. I went there in January of '96, and the fences were still up, still operating bait. There were still military guards at that base. And, you know, we had 450 plus or minus standing buildings that were vacant, an entire infrastructure system that had to be rebuilt. Just a tremendous amount of investment. I no longer remember the numbers, but I think it was, in the end, over $100 million. We had a couple of things which turned out to be quite different from some of the other urban renewal projects that we talk about now. But at the very beginning, the cities of Denver and Aurora sat on the municipal boundary, which was both a blessing and a curse for us. Put together a board and developed an urban renewal plan, which was run through the Denver Urban Renewal District, DURA, and along sort of standard lines. But the one thing that was sort of unique about Lowry, was that it had zero property basis. So we've been talking a little bit about tax increment as what you can take out of the system, back out of the system, is the increment in the tax in the urban renewal district. And at Lowry, with zero basis in the land, because the federal government doesn't think it has to pay taxes to municipalities and states and such a thing. So we had 1,700 acres that paid no taxes. So that gave us a good basis for the tax increment. The other thing I think that's really worth noting about Lowry's situation versus most of these others is, in fact, we did do most of that infrastructure development with other funds, and the reason we acquired the property from the federal government basically for a note, so we didn't have sort of the debt payment issues on the front, and that gave us some advantages. And eventually the note got written down because for reasons that don't bear on this, but the government couldn't deliver the property in the manner it intended. But so we didn't have this running capital cost. And so we basically funded our infrastructure with a different type of bonding mechanism for the sale of the land. We acted like a conventional real estate developer in that respect. But what this gets us back to is we had this whole tax increment available basically for demolition, some environmental cleanup, and amenities. So that's where that increment went. And so we got a little more miles out of it on the amenity side. So at Lowry, all of the public amenities we have no metro districts and none of those additional surcharges that you talk about with some of these other special districts and things. So we had a little leg up on that. What we did differently is that structural is unlike all these other ones we've talked about, we did not have a sales tax increment. Now, since I'm with the city, I've come to learn that the municipal finances are driven largely by sales tax for reasons that relate to valuation, particularly in residential areas. And Lowry is substantially a residential project if you really look at it as a whole. So we did it all on so our tax increment was based solely on a property tax, and the city, and we basically took all of it, and then the city took all the sales tax that came from the development that Greg subsequently was involved with on our one retail program, which is a relatively small portion of our work. So we had those tools in place, and I think that without that, the project probably still would have gone forward. We were very fortunate. I've always said that we were geniuses because we decided to become developers in 1996 in an urban area right at the beginning of the growth cycle, and that made us all very, very smart. And if you started 4 years ago, I don't think there's anything that'll ever make you smart. But but the fact is, those tools allowed us to deliver what we believe to be just a tremendous development. I mean, vanity being what it is, I don't take much credit except that I was able to ride that wave. But all the amenity systems came out of the tax increment financing. So it goes to how you can choose to use that tool, because Lowry's parks, Lowry's, the whole things that we believe make it beautiful and wonderful all came from that. And frankly, having those monies set aside and apart allowed us to have a more socially conscious program, a more attractive program to impose design restrictions on guys like Greg to drive him completely crazy. But I will tell you that the value in the real estate, that because we had those higher standards, paid back again, because now we had a higher standard project, and ultimately there's a premium for living there. So that extra that we were invested because we had this tool available created more tax revenue, but it created a more livable environment, and I think we could have never done it without that. So
Davis, and maybe others could, and I think, Dan, this would be true in some of the examples that you have. I mean, you have, in the Lowry example, you had an Air Force base that was there, and the community kind of grew up around it and was stabilized, arguably, by that Air Force base for a number of years, as maybe the mall and other projects that you were involved in. So what was the net results of the vitality of the neighborhood on the borders of Lowry, or on the borders of Belmar, or what you're expecting in other projects that happens after urban renewal and after a project?
Yeah, it's clear, and this is important because what Mark brings up is that there's this incredible fear when they shut that base. You know, the people that came in, they had huge public hearings, and there's this incredible fear that this is going to be one of the big bases in Texas. I think it was part of Fort Hood or something. Sat vacant for 20 years, and that was the fear in the community. They had colossal, difficult public hearings about the worry that this was going to destroy the values of everything out. And the reverse is in fact true. The investment in the adjoining communities and the values of properties directly adjoining to it have risen and grown as a result of that reinvestment. So in addition to what I want to brag about, the fact of the matter is all the neighboring communities and individuals that lived in those communities saw their property values increase and their lifestyles improve as well, and they became beneficiaries of those amenities as well. And that's a very good point.
Mark, I think one of the things that was important with LRA, the Redevelopment Authority that Davis was with, is that they had this 15-year vision. And I think that's one of the things that's important for this particular project.
Absolutely.
In particular, is you've got this Urban Renewal Authority, and everybody kind of thinks of it in a microcosm of 3, 4, or 5 years of developing a retail project or whatever it is. When you start dealing with a project of this magnitude, you have to think long term, and you have to be patient. And in today's world, you have to be more than patient. You have to be patient and have deep pockets. But LRA went in there with this idea, this vision of this is what it was going to be. And we did the Lowry Town Center there. And I can't tell you how many times one of his
Lowry Town Center
colleagues,
being the retail project.
The retail component of this, we went to battle with Ann Rosen. I mean, over things that were just ridiculous. But looking back at that project today, it set the bar for what we were doing from that point forward, when we learned so much. And because they were patient and because they had the right vision and they were it was carefully thought through, that in the end, we all were much more proud of the project, and I can speak and raise my hand. I've lived there now for 12 years. I was resident number 19. I bought in, I drank the Kool-Aid. I better have for what we were investing in the project. So, but in the end, that's something I can deliver to the city here, the people that are going to be involved with this Greyhound redevelopment is you have to be patient. You have to be prepared to live by your guidelines for a long time, because they may not come to fruition for a long time. And Lowry is still building homes. They still have some of the best retained values in the market.
I would echo that. And I would tell you that for Westminster, our vision for the Westminster Mall redevelopment actually started, oh golly, about 15 years ago. And we began actually setting the stage of other projects so that we would have the ability, if necessary, to completely close the Westminster Mall when we got to that redevelopment project. So, 10, 15 years ago we started, and during that time we started establishing a vision for the redevelopment of the Westminster Mall project, with an idea that this project is going to have probably a 15 to 20 year span to develop. If it developed faster, believe me, we'd all be very, very happy. But we've gone into it saying it's going to take time. This is not something that will happen overnight. Every urban renewal project that I've seen has generally had some sort of hiccup or something, and it takes time. If you're going to go in and try to rush it, I would say that you're setting yourself up for some negative outfall. If you take your time, get the answers that you need, decide how this fits into the overall city, how it fits into your overall strategy for government, then you have a better chance of success.
I mean, and maybe just a couple more comments. I happen to live between Belmar and the Riverfront project. Never would have shopped those places or gone to those places had they not been there. So, and I don't live in either Sheridan or Lakewood. I mean, the panel can talk about some of that in-migration effects that happen when a successful urban renewal project is undertaken and executed properly.
I can offer a few observations. I think what Susan's talking about is exactly right. I think the city of Lakewood started thinking about the redevelopment of Villa Italia in the late 80s. Yes. It wasn't until 1999 that Continuum bought the land underlying Villa Italia, and it's now 2011. It's 12 years later. It's still not finished. I mean, those are 15, 20-year projects once you get started. And they clearly have increased the values. When we started the residential component, the for sale residential, we didn't know, what sort of demand there was going to be. We assumed that maybe it was going to sell at a couple $100 a square foot. When it started selling, it sold at $300 a square foot. I mean, there was that sort of demand for it. And when you create the right environment, people want to be there. And we were fortunate to sort of envision that in an appropriate way, that it did drive people to do that. And it was interesting when we were conceiving of it and trying to figure out what it should be, and it's always easier to look back and figure out what it should be, but when you've got sort of a blank slate and you're trying to figure out, well, what should be retail and what kind of retail and what sort of retailers, and the sort of typical retailer looks at their market in concentric circles, in 1 and 3 and 5 mile rings. And it's very difficult to get them to look at it in any other way. And if we'd done solely that at Belmar, we would have had a bunch of dollar stores. If you looked at the residential neighborhoods immediately around it. Now, those residential neighborhoods have improved significantly and benefited significantly. The apartment project immediately to the south sold for a record price, a couple of years after Belmar opened. So it sort of, it's just all a high tide, right? All boats rise with the tide rising. And so we had to sort of take a little different view of it. I live out sort of southwest in the same area that Mark does, and frankly, our perspective about Belmar was it was going to draw from areas that were outside those 3 concentric circles. It was more like a kidney, shape. And when we go to talk to retailers, it took a lot of persuading to convince them to look at it in a different way.
It's called begging.
Well, yeah, we did a lot of it.
Well, actually, I mean, it is an interesting question about begging, Greg, and where we are in today's environment. I don't think there's probably anybody in the audience who hasn't been affected in our panel about conditions of the economy and how it affects our enterprises. And I wonder if you can kind of correlate doing real estate development projects in today's environment and the importance of urban renewal. Would you undertake a 60-acre project like we have in Commerce City today, given the entrepreneurial tools that you had, notwithstanding urban renewal, and just what it means to anybody, and certainly the Westminster malls and that, who you're trying to attract? How important is it? And why, and put it in context of, let's see, desirable retailer coming to you and say, yeah, okay, I'll come to Commerce City or one of your projects, and here's my deal.
Yeah, I would tell you that yes, we would look at those projects, but we wouldn't look at them without the urban renewal, and that goes down the road of there's, it's a simple equation. I mean, I always laugh about how people think our business is so complicated. It's really simple. It's cost, and it's income, and it's what do you make at the end of the day. I mean, it's simple as that, and usually that what you make at the end of the day is not nearly what you think it is, but there's only certain things you can change in your project. The land value is what it's going to be because the market's going to dictate that land value. Whether you pay for it or whether you use eminent domain or however it happens, the land is fixed. The project cost is fixed. It's going to cost you so much for bricks and mortar to build the building. Everything comes into an equation. The one piece you can't control is the begging part, which is the $18 million with 25-cent return, is today especially, the pool of tenants has gone from this in 2003 to this. And of those guys that actually have a balance sheet you want to deal with, it's gotten a lot smaller. So, and then they know that. Not only are they the prettiest girl at the prom, they got the shortest dress and they got the fastest car, and they know you want to date them. And so you walk in there and there's no secrets. You break out the knee pads and go straight to the ground and beg them for the project. And I'm exaggerating, obviously, but the tenants are very demanding in today's market, and in today's world, what they will pay you in rent is directly correlated to what they think they will do in sales. And there's no magic there. They'll tell you whether it's a 10% cost of occupancy or a 7% or a 3% or whatever number they feel like telling you that day. But it's real, and you can check it. So it's not like they're lying to you all the time, but they're giving you what they think they can pay you. So that's another thing that vacillates. So the only way we can get the income to help us cover some of those things, the land value, the project costs that we cannot control, so to speak, are using these tools, using tax increment financing, using public improvement fees to try and whittle away at those costs to try and create a viable project. And when I say viable, it's not like I go build a $5 million project and put $2 million in my pocket. Good luck. That does not exist.
Has anybody heard this when I happen to be involved in a project today with a major retailer in a community that the entire community is the Urban Renewal Authority, and the retailer comes and said, yeah, I'll come, but I want free land, free building, free infrastructure, free parking lot, landscaping, and so forth. And I know I'm going to make money, but that's what my demand. Anybody dealing with that these days?
Yeah.
Is that the
I got that
norm
written
or
down
not?
here. Free, plus they want part of your incentives.
Yes.
And
So
part of
it's,
that's the newest
the
one.
way it
And all the
works.
tax revenue increase for the next 30 years, back to me.
That's kind of the
Oh, yeah,
world
that's
that
right.
we're in.
You know, I think.
And it's
I
hard
feel,
to say no, but
but you
have
do.
to.
You have to.
You have
You
to.
have to.
So we'll
It's not
if
the
that
cost.
situation
Yeah. Well, I
shows
know.
up in Westminster, the community mothers and fathers are recognizing that sort of dynamic in today's
Yes, yes,
environment?
The way that we look at any kind of assistance that we would provide to a business or a developer is, one, does it make sense to what our goals are for our city as a whole? So we know what our economic development goals are. We know what we need what certain retailers, if it's retail, that we want to attract, what kind of non-retailers we want to attract. And if it's part of that group, then we're more inclined to say yes. But we also let the developer
Could you folks pull your mics up a little closer?
Okay.
Thanks.
We also let the developer and the users understand that we have a city to operate and that it costs money to operate our community. And so we share with them that we can't give 100% for 10 or 20 or 30 years. We can share some percentage of the revenue that they're providing for a few years to help them get up and going, to help them make this project get going. Our council has been unanimous in saying, no, we will not provide 100% over an extended period of time.
But Susan, don't you think a lot of cities have learned from the lessons of the last decade? I mean, again, not to name names, but there's a few major retailers around the country that cut these incredible deals, and I think that these cities are kind of ruining the day they cut some of those incredible
I'm not sure I
deals.
agree with that.
Oh, I do. I know of a few.
Yeah, but.
Well, I think that you have.
Where it was a whole windfall for the developer, and now these stores aren't generating
Well,
the
let's
sales
talk
tax
about-
they had promised.
Let's talk about windfall developers. I mean, who, the beneficiaries of urban renewal project, I think is kind of the discussion. You know, retailers get all these things and they're after all the engine often that does this back. Developers get some money, communities get benefit. So on balance, where does everybody shake out in this? I mean, in your experience? And Davis, maybe you've been on both sides of the fence.
You know, and I'm probably on both sides of the fence of the answer. I mean, the goal, you know, is we try and do an analysis so everybody takes a reasonable look that it says equal benefit to the community. And I mean, the general term is but for, I don't know if it's statutory or not, but the analysis that's supposed to be done is but for this presumed benefit for the community, the project would not move forward. So if the analysis is done properly, you know, it should be mutually beneficial. That's the intent. But there are both, you know, there are large format retailers who have been known to show up and say, we want everything for us. And then the communities often are faced with the idea of, does the traffic, the peripheral benefit to the community of their bare existence cover the cost in some way? And communities have been leveraged and literally lost money on some of these development deals. And on the other side, you know, there's more than one developer who believes they've been fully extorted by the community that they've moved into in one format or another. And so I've been on both sides. So
Yeah.
They really need to look at what your goals are and what the benefits are and do an honest analysis. If you're trying to generate revenue as your intention, you need to make sure you're doing that and you've covered the cost of your services, because if you build a shopping center, you need police and you need fire and there's a bunch of public services you have to deliver. So you really, if you're trying to treat it as a revenue generator, you need to make sure that you haven't given away that generation and made it not worthwhile.
And that's, you know, I want to throw out some percentages because I think they're really important, and I, you know, I'll throw them out, and then there's always exceptions because it's not a one-to-one relationship. But in my experience, if there's a 30% gap, I see that every day. No big
Just
deal.
explain the gap.
Okay, so back to what we're saying, it's very simple. Costs me X dollars to deliver the project to the market. It's going to generate Y dollars in revenue if I've got a gap between what I'm going to generate and what it's going to cost. And the whole rule of urban renewal is that usually that cost is higher. You have aged infrastructure. Sometimes it's not at capacity. Acquisition costs for land. I often say if a developer comes in and wants to do a Wendy's on the edge of the community, nobody shows up at the P&Z meeting. I mean, nobody gives a crap, I guess. But if they want to do something in the heart of the community, everybody shows up, whether they own property or not, because it's the heart of the community and they feel some ownership of it. That all costs money. That's all good, but that all costs money. So in my experience in evaluating development pro formas for cities and saying, is this a reasonable request, 20% easy. 30% all day long. When I start to get close to 48 to 50%, I start to say,
I'm writing this down. Don't go to a
maybe
town
we're
in
trying,
Annandale with a deal
maybe
that's over
we're trying
50%.
too hard. And then again, you know, and I don't want to pick on anybody, and I'm not, and I really don't take this out of context, but for instance, the Sheridan project along Santa Fe, that was in the 45 to 50% fill. But that's not, you can't look at that number in isolation because it did churn blight around, and it did put properties into productive use, and it did generate jobs, and it did do some of these secondary impacts. So I wouldn't, you know, stay
So
hard
the vision
and
was right
fast.
there.
But 30%, bring it on. That's not a big deal.
She's
But then,
bashing my project, but that's okay.
but I start to question where's that
But there was
anchor?
so
But-
much more than just.
That's what I just
That
said.
wasn't buying a piece of
Absolutely.
ground and going and scraping off some ugly old buildings and starting over. We removed 750,000 cubic
Absolutely.
yards of trash out of a landfill.
Yeah,
Well,
yeah,
and
you
a
know,
lot
I
of
live
times
out-
you set the tone or set the stage for other development to be able to occur. You know, I know
Oh, it
that we've
absolutely is,
had,
and that's a pivotal intersection at Hamden and Santa Fe that was ignored for so
Right.
many years, and we were lucky enough, or shall we say, we had the bullseye on us when we did Cinderella City, and then we moved across the street into Sheridan. And between the two of those, I think I've got the list of what not to do in development on those two projects alone. But it was such a pivotal intersection. It will continue to evolve, and Embry came in and built, you know, nice
Yeah,
apartments
apartments.
that have leased. And Sports Authority moved their corporate headquarters to Inglewood as a result of that. And so, yeah, I agree. Our number was huge. It was absolutely huge.
But, and it did, and I absolutely believe that. But what I guess the message I want to send to the Commerce City City Council is that as you move forward with the dog track, I mean, it's a portfolio of assets. And if on some of the deals that happen there, you're at a 40% gap fill, and some you're at 10, and you average out somewhere between 25 and 30, I call that a very, very successful project. So
Yes.
don't feel bad about that. That's how it gets done these days.
Dan, your urban renewal project's taking your attorney's hat off and putting your development hat on. What's the lowest percentage of gap that you had to total cost?
In terms of the monies we got, or what the gap actually was?
What the gap that needed to be filled?
Yeah.
Well, the reason I asked the question is,
I know.
oftentimes, you know, not surprisingly, the municipal officials are trying to fulfill their responsibilities, and they're skeptical when the developer comes in and says, you know, I've got this gap of X and I need it, and, you know, they think that you're skimming money off and you're gonna put all this money in your pocket. And frankly, in almost every circumstance I can think of, I know I was a developer, and I know I'm a lawyer now, and I'm not sure whether I'm moving higher or lower on the evolutionary scale as a result of that transition.
On the food
You
chain.
evolved, you've evolved.
I'm hoping up, but you know, you never know.
Bumping along the bottom of all of this.
Oftentimes, you end up getting less than you really need. I think, you know, sometimes, I think the percentage in a deal Mark and I did was 5%.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I think that's what we
Was
did.
what-
That's
Paid it off
incredibly
pretty
What you
quickly.
got.
Yeah,
I've
And,
never
uh,
seen one below 15, so.
Yeah, we did.
I
Thorn
think-
Creek was 5.
I think we got was
Wow.
5%.
Good for you.
And the
5%.
gap was at least double that.
Yeah.
But you do have those gaps. I mean, it's, you know, in Belmar, we had $180 million of infrastructure put in between streets and roads, and we had $2 million of environmental cleanup alone from, you know, dry cleaning solvent that was dumped in the ground 20 years before. I mean, so you know, I mean, the idea of a landfill, you know, having to go and redo that. I mean,
I'd take that $2 million deal.
Yeah. I live out in that part of town, and I tell you, I spend a lot more time at Target and Costco and the movie theater there than I ever did at the landfill.
That's true.
So Commerce City took a very bold step in keeping their community viable, and you're to be congratulated
Yes,
for doing that by buying the dog track. And so there's probably a lot of questions of what happens now, and let's talk about that a little bit. And starting with, you know, where market studies fit in and what role they play, what should be going on with that. Let's think about what to do with the dog track now sort of situation. And Ann, I know you've been involved in a lot of those, and we'll start with you.
Yeah, and I feel really strongly about this too. I started my career in 1985 and spent a number of years doing market studies, and that's where The developer had already gone to the architect, and the architect had drawn a beautiful building, and they had already fallen in love with it at that point. And then they came to me and said, can we make this thing work? So we very quickly
No, they're
developed.
always looking at you, Greg.
Oh, totally.
I'm
And
only doing what the city tells me to do.
we, and we really quickly, in our industry, came up with a term that's called an ugly baby. And that's when a developer brings you a project that doesn't work, and you know, nobody wants to tell somebody that their kid is ugly, so it's like, you tell them, I don't want to tell them. But those were market studies, and there is a world of difference between a market study and a market strategy. And if there's nothing more that I get to convey to the city of Commerce City today, it would be that you absolutely prepare a market strategy for that site. And herein lies the difference. A market study has about a 6-month shelf life. It says, can you or can you not do this land use, and this land use? But it never says what's your goal, and if this is your goal, and here's market reality today, what does it take to get from here to here? And largely, there's a couple of ways, at least, that we approach it. One is market feasibility and financial feasibility are two entirely different things. And that's why we're talking about urban renewal. There can be market demand for these uses, but that doesn't mean a developer can bring that product to the market. So the first thing you have to do is say, is there market demand for these different kind of land uses and product types? Then you have to check in with the community, and you have to say, okay, here's the community vision and here's market reality. Now we have to start building the bridge between those things, because there always requires a lot of education. You think you can get Nordstrom's, you can't. Think you can get Ann Taylor, you can't. You've got all this stuff down the road that's just north of Stapleton. That's your direct competition. So it's what's left over. How is our market growing? What can our trajectory be beyond the obvious market? You have to answer all those questions. But then as a city, what you have to do is you have to step back and say, okay, we've answered the market demand question, and we're looking at the feasibility, the market feasibility question. But you can have barriers to investment laying under the surface where you couldn't have possibly imagined them. And so what we found is that they kind of live within 6 silos. You have market, financial, regulatory, political, organizational, and I can't remember the other one, but
Rick Perry?
Rick Perry.
there you go.
Lob that one up
Nice,
there.
that was so clever. But
The education department.
but the idea is that if you answer the market question and you begin to answer the financial feasibility question, you might have regulations out there that present unintended barriers to the developer. So if you can clean those up in advance, that's a terrific thing. You've cut time off the developer's project schedule. That saves him money. You get credit on your side of the balance sheet. If you've got political issues because of neighborhood concerns and you haven't gone out and talked to the neighborhood and all that. So it's looking at all those silos. That's what a market strategy should do, is identify those barriers to investment so that when you come to the table, you're truly ready to tell the story of what you can do, what you're willing to do, what your vision is, and what you think the market is. Not limiting the developer's creativity, saying what's possible, not saying it must be this.
That happens all before you do an RFP for a developer, doesn't
Absolutely.
it?
Don't go out to RFP
what is the
until you
thing
know.
called? What's RFP?
An RFP.
RFQ? What are those things?
Request for proposal, request for qualifications. As part of the urban renewal requirements, as you are selecting a developer to work with you to develop your project, you have to usually go for some sort of RFP, request for proposal, and have proposals submitted to you. There is a lot, though, as Ann was talking about, that needs to be taken care of prior to even doing a request for proposal to select a developer. Things like, as mentioned, doing that strategy. You know, first, I want to echo what was said. I believe, Mark, you made it. Hats off to Commerce City for taking control. One of the first questions that I get many times, in the last 3 major projects that I've done, when I've gone to a developer is, do you have control? They always ask, do you have control? Sometimes I spag a little bit on that. But
Sorta.
yeah, a little bit. You have control. That's what they want to do. You own the land. Do you have control over how it can be used? And when you can say as a community, yes, then developers get a little bit more interested because they know that you can control when that property can be put in, when it doesn't have to be put in, those types of things. But, you know, look at how to get control of your destiny and those types of things. One of the things that we needed to do for the Westminster Mall redevelopment effort was to relook at our codes. There is not a single zoning regulation in the city of Westminster that will allow us to do what we want to do at the Westminster, on the Westminster Mall property. We are having to review our codes and review our regulations to allow us to do a very urban project. We have very suburban regulations. And so we spent time talking as staff about, well, what do we need to change to be able to allow this kind of project to happen? We spent also a good bit of time talking to developers all over the country, saying, this is what we're thinking about. What do what do we need to look at? What are concerns? What are issues? We've spent a good bit of time looking at projects all over the United States to see what is that project that we want it to be. One of the things that we did is what we call a massing study, because we got to an idea of we wanted a certain type of project to happen at a certain type of density, and we wanted to be sure that as staff we were on the same page as our city council. And then city council wanted to be sure that they were on the same page with their constituents. And so we had a pretty picture drawn that's probably not going to be anything what is going to eventually be built, but at least gave us something to go out and say, this is what we're thinking about. And then we also took it out to those retail market folks, office market folks, a variety of people that are doing projects in the market and saying, this is what we're thinking. Residential developers, every one of them said, you can't do that project overnight. And it's like, we understand that, but what if we have a 15 to 20 year horizon? Well, yeah, that project would work. So all of that is to say what, is kind of to put examples of what we did to what Ann was saying. That's all been done without having a developer selected. It was, we've done all of that to get us prepared so that we could go to a developer and say, this is what we're thinking about. We know the market generally says this. We need to do a whole lot more market study, a lot more detail, but this is generally what the market says that it can do. So
you think, this will be
That
more
was a
interplay.
long-
So there's really a reason that Diaz is set up this way with the developer on one end of the table and Davis on the other end of the table, who's had, and everybody's on the five of you have all been in the process of developer selection, if not municipality selection. I'd like to kind of get that interplay, and I know that Greg is a handsome guy, and he could probably win damn near any beauty contest that he entered.
especially with the short skirt on.
So,
A fast car.
He's already established that he
It's
goes
just
to
an
his knees
analogy.
quickly, so.
Davis, what was it about Greg's
you know,
beauty that you selected him, and how does that whole, what are you looking for when you're looking at Greg or any other developer?
We said yes.
You
I'm just
know, I want to start, since we seem to be okay to needle here, and to point out that I actually work in the day I work in the development, and at night I pretend I'm a city councilman, and I happen to have a project in Westminster that I represent a real estate trust on at the moment. And suffice it to say, to demonstrate that I can look at this thing from both sides, I would suggest that the city of Westminster can occasionally set the bar too high to the place where a person can't possibly move forward on the project, not throwing aspersions at
But it isn't
anybody.
It's not an economic development project, is it?
But it doesn't happen to be in Susan's span of control, so perhaps it would be different. But from my standpoint, there really are two separate tasks you can do here, the tract of setting a very high benchmark and moving forward was a lot more, was very successful at Lowry. But again, we were all, as I said before, we were all geniuses because of the time at which we decided to send that benchmark. It's much more difficult now. And it's very possible, and there was one of our urban renewal district in Wheat Ridges, they ran a preliminary design charrette and did some samples to go out and try and do a fairly modern planning developed style project, and went out to the market and found out there really was no market. So you have to be very careful what you do here. For me personally, I think the most, if you have a vision of what you want, and I think that you need to start with something, it may not work. The real thing you're looking for in the RFQ process, in my mind, is somebody that has a demonstrated financial ability and completion ability for the type of thing you are doing, that they can show that they have already been able to jump that particular set of hoops in a way that gives you confidence that you're working with somebody that can complete your project. Because if you don't have those first two elements, if you have those first two elements, like we did when Miller Weingarten was selected, when Greg was down there, you know then you are sort of haggling at that point with somebody that can actually get it through. But to go through all that pain and suffering, as has happened to so many of us these last couple of years, sometimes from nobody's fault because of what's happened to the market, to go through all that same pain and suffering and then have nothing at the far end because the capacity to do the deal on the back end just was never there to begin with. You know, that is a dead end you don't want to put your time and energy in. So I would focus on making sure you have a financially viable partner, and one that has been done specifically the type of program you're looking to do, because without that you are just running in circles in my opinion.
You know, Mark, I think there are a lot of factors that we've talked about that go into making that RFP process as successful as possible. I think as Susan and Ann indicated, and Davis, you've got to have a strategic plan and vision for what you think the project's going to be. And while at the same time you have to, I think, be careful not to undershoot what the possibilities are, you have to also be realistic. I mean, when we started Belmar, people looked at the immediately surrounding area and looked at the demographics and said, you know, you're talking about putting higher end retailers in there, then the community is going to be able to support. And, you know, so we had to figure out whether we could draw from a broader area that could really support those retailers, and yet also have retailers that were a good mix that could be supported by, you know, a closer community. And I think you got to figure out those things, and whether it's retail, a combination of retail and office and residential and other uses, you got to figure out sort of what that appropriate mix might be. And you're never going to get it perfect when you're envisioning it, but you've got to think long and hard about sort of what those components are, and you got to take into account, obviously, the thoughts and opinions of the community. And I think some of the things that Greg said sort of go into this as well. You know, there's a shrinking pool of available users and tenants, so you got to make yourself as attractive as possible, because those people, you know, the users and tenants, they want to go to the most appealing site that has the least potential challenges to it. I mean, I'm sure when you told them you were going to, you know, take out huge quantities of, you know, landfill and trash, I'm sure that most of the tenants
One
didn't look at you
word,
and say,
methane. That was, yeah.
they did sort of jump
Scared
at the
it.
possibility.
No,
And
the
so,
list got real small.
once you've got to figure out ways to eliminate those problems. So is that eliminating a building? You know, are there potential environmental problems? If you get rid of those problems or potential problems, or, you know, something that somebody's going to look at as a hurdle up front, you make yourself a more attractive candidate. You're going to get more potential respondents to the RFP that have greater capabilities. So I think you can create an environment where you can achieve a more successful outcome by sort of being more strategic about it up front and thinking about who are the potential users, what are the appropriate uses, how do I make this site more appealing to those potential users, and so I have a better opportunity to select somebody who's going to be successful. At the same time, you've got to take sort of a long-term view. The real estate business is an incredibly cyclical business. I mean, the changes in the economy have had drastic impacts on the real estate economy. Now it's making significant strides in select areas, select sort of product types. But you've got to be able to sort of bend and flow with those changes in the economy. And so if you only got one particular type of use, you know, you're likely to be more deeply impacted by changes in the economy. I mean, when we did Belmar, we got approved a certain amount of retail, a certain amount of office, a certain amount of residential, but not in particular locations. And so, you know, those were going to move. So maybe residential was more valuable, or there was more demand for it. Maybe there was office, there was more demand at a particular point in time, or retail. And so you got to give yourself flexibility. Frankly, is the key to having a successful
All
project.
right, so we need vision.
Yeah.
We need to define the vision. We know that it's going to take some time, and we need to clean the place up. So let's talk a little specifically. I'd like to have everybody weigh in here with your thoughts, your experience, and what we've been talking about tonight with urban renewal as it relates to the dog track. What do you see as some of the hurdles or impediment to success, so that the dog track is a successful project like many of you have been involved with, and doesn't linger like some of the other projects that we've seen in our metropolitan area? Susan?
Yeah, go ahead, Susan. I, from a developer's perspective, and these guys all hit the nail on the head. It's doing your homework and having that research, so it makes it easier for us, because we're not a very bright group. We need something very simple and straightforward to be able to go forward on. But I think if there was 2 words I could use that have failed me at every time that we've had a problem, it's called managing expectations. Mm-hmm. It's the 2 greatest words in the world that people run away from. And that managing expectations goes from both sides of the equation. You talk about the ugly baby. You know, I like it when somebody tells me you screwed up, you need to start over, because I go fire the architect and get somebody else. Unless it's David, who got us the project at Lowry. But I think that's a really important piece, is that you need to understand from this perspective what your asset is and what you can do with that asset. And we've been sitting here talking about retail and everything else. I look at this project and I see it as a mixed-use project. I see it as potentially being driven more by residential initially than by retail. There's a lot of retail in this corridor, and the Northfield doesn't exactly tell a great story. It tells an okay story, and thank God Forest City's got dollars behind it. But there's been a lot of fits and starts as a result of a lot of different things there. You got to figure out what this project really is, given its amount of frontage on the freeway. Can it really be retail? Can you sell the community on putting a town center in the middle of the damn block? Because when they told us that we were putting the Lowry Town Center at 2nd and Quebec, which was 4 blocks from where I thought it needed to be, I would have told them they were crazy. But at the same time, they told us what they wanted, we told them what the challenges were, and we managed the project together to come up with an outcome that in the end was perfect. So I think that's one of the biggest things, is understanding that, and I always laugh about this, because 5 years ago you went into these ULI studies, or you went into these ICSE seminars, and you would literally the guys would sit down and they would sit there and say, we're building a mixed-use, TOD, pedestrian-friendly, multi-level town center that's gonna be special. Every acronym out there that everybody wanted
just
to.
like Belmar.
And you were the bane of my existence. Yes. I can't tell you how many times that damn project ran thanks to their PR group, and every time we went in, everybody was like, well, we want this.
And he never invited
I'm
you
like,
to the
this is a field and there's nobody near here. Okay, we need an urban environment. So that's the other thing, is understanding your asset. That's so important, to understand what you can do here and what is realistic. That's from my perspective.
And then-
Susan?
Oh, okay.
Go ahead, Ann.
Can we go down the row? Okay.
Yeah, that's fine.
So my big thing is, we talked about the market and doing as much due diligence and all that, but in that because that's exactly what I was gonna say, was managing expectations, but for me, it's knowing that you have many, many audiences. City council, you need to get them ready for the 30 to 40% gap fill discussion. You need to talk to them about return on investment, and that's direct impact and secondary impact. You've got to talk to the neighborhood and what their expectations are and how their property values will be impacted and traffic and everything else. Every one of those audiences needs a different piece of the story, and you can't just come out with one promo piece and think that that one size fits all. So it's dealing with those different audiences and knowing what each one of them needs to hear to have their expectations managed so that they can be in it for the long haul and survive different councils being reelected and that.
Yeah, I mean,
What would you offer?
you have to have that political commitment to bring it about. These projects take a long time. And, you know, it's difficult, I think, for councils when they're faced with, you know, a citizenry that isn't happy with what's happening at that moment. And people are impatient. It's just, we're Americans. We're impatient for everything. And these sorts of projects don't happen, you know, with the snap of a finger. And sometimes it looks like it's not going in the right direction. And I mean, when I've done 10 redevelopment projects. I don't mean to just keep talking about Belmar, but it had sort of so many different factors that it was sort of a good example of a lot of these things. When we first started talking to community groups, there were a lot of people who basically said, just put a new coat of paint on Villa Italia and everything will be fine. I mean, there was one department store left. There were basically t-shirt shops, knife stores, really great, and tennis shoe stores, and that was it. And obviously they weren't going to survive, but there was a meaningful segment of the community that said, just repaint it and everything will be fine. And it took literally 2 years of community meetings to sort of coalesce a common perspective and perception of idea about what this should be. And so, you know, that's difficult for a council. Everybody somebody wants it to be this, somebody wants it to be the opposite. And you really have to have that political will to get it done. And it is managing expectations. And you try to find sort of the common threads in those things. And you can't shoot too high. You've got to try not to shoot too low at the same time. And you got to be realistic about sort of what those options are.
And flexible.
Susan, when you answer your question, I'd like to also kind of have you interweave, you know, the notion of municipalities acting more in the development role, master developers selecting, you know, groups of developers, which obviously happened at Lowry as well.
Okay. What I would first say to Commerce City about this particular, or, you know, the dog park area and other projects, is look beyond your city boundary. How is this property going to affect this whole region? How does it fit into the bigger puzzle? And then how, you know, and then how do you need it to fit or solve the issues or visions or desires that you have for a city? This particular property actually can have a huge influence area. Look at it that way. As municipalities, we tend to look at our municipal boundaries as the limits of our influence. Developers, users, office users, retail users, all of those folks have no idea where our city boundaries are. We as municipalities do. Look outside of your boundary and look at the influence of this, what the potential influence of this project could be. As far as a master developer, what I would say is the only ones that can really establish what the vision for an area is the local government or local municipality or local government. That would be with the help of your constituents. I would say that sometimes you need to bring in experts to come and be part of that. But what you want this area to be is going to be something that you need to look at in your overall strategic plan. I can tell you it would have been a heck of a lot easier for us to have decided not to make the Westminster Mall area an urban center. It would have been, we would have never gotten the orchard built up on 144th if we hadn't said this is what we would like to see happen there. And once we took our vision out to the developers and said this is what we would like to see,
Then we were able to come back and do a master plan that was more part of what a developer would be able to market off of. So what I would say is that you kind of have to have a master plan or strategic plan for your entire community, understanding the individual pieces, and then once you've selected someone to come in to work with you, is at that point work with that development group to do a master plan. But that master planner or master developer doesn't have to be the same developer for the entire parcel. One of the things that was real helpful for us when we were looking at the 100 acres for the mall was to understand outside of suburbia how big 100 acres is. And one of our planners actually took that property and put an aerial photo of the baseball stadium and Lodo on top of that 100 acres. And all of a sudden it gave us a lot of perspective of, oh wow, we can do a lot with that. And so, you know, understanding what you can do with it. The other, you know, as far as, so back to the master developer, there's one thing to have a master planner, master developer look at how this is how it should all develop, but it doesn't have to be one developer that develops it all. You can have a variety of developers. On 100 acres, we easily could have 4 different or more different developers come in and work with us. I did want to say that one of the detriments that I see, and it's not huge, but something that will have to be dealt with, is that the old dog track has no value. It has historic feelings for people probably, but as far as being able to use it, it will have to be either figured out how to incorporate it into a project or torn down. As we were working with projects in the past, the hardest thing, particularly with residents, but even with commercial properties, is to let someone know that, yeah, your property may have, this property may have a lot of value to you, this building has a lot of value to you, but as a part of this property, it has 0 value. And so it needed to be taken down. You know, watching the Macy's and Mervyn's and all of those buildings come down at the mall, none of those buildings have any value as far as what the future of that 100 acres is. That will be something that will need to be decided. Do you want to keep those structures that are out there, or do you want to take them down? It needs to be decided at some point. Realize that you don't have all the answers. And I've done a lot of retail, worked with a lot of retail development, but I still go to the experts, the brokers, the developers, those folks, to say, what do you think? I need your input. I need your feedback. Tell me, because, you know, no one person has all the answers. We even on all of our projects work as a huge team inside the city with the engineers and utility folks and things like that to try to make the project. And then the other is, once you set your plan for the property, be willing to toss it out.
Get flexibility, yeah.
You know, is always be flexible. As much as you plan for the future, I will tell you that, you know, if some major national company came in and needed 100 acres for a major employer, we might very well throw out all of our other vision. And so just know that that's that possibility. And the other thing is, you don't know what the market's going to be. So always stay flexible. And then the last thing I will say, and always have a plan B. No matter how you go forward, we've moved forward on several projects and have been thankful for plan B, C, and D on a variety of things. And so always be thinking of, well, if this doesn't work, what would we do next?
We're going to leave a little time for Q&A, but Davis, I wonder if you could weigh in on this briefly.
Well, it's not going to affect my reelection campaign, so no. You can't see it from within the boundaries of Wheat Ridge, so I really, no. I listen to all that. I think Susan really hit all the major points. I think that you need to recognize there's an iterative component of this where you take input from the community as to what it wants, and you bounce that input off of the community, off of the retail community or whatever the market is for whatever you're trying to postulate you can do. I think you need to look at how it fits into your master plan, your time horizon. A strong facilities assessment on the physical conditions of the site need to be done, and then you're just going to grind on an iteration until you get a vision that you can begin to try. And the word that I heard, other than manage expectation, which meant the most to me, is flexibility. You will one day be faced a choice between your big, highest and best vision and what's practical today, and you're going to have a decision to make as which of those is more important to you somewhere in that process. So.
Good final admonition. Let's open it up and see if we can answer some questions that you might have.
And we have 2 microphones. Julie will have one, and I will have another. And we're going to start right here with Norm. Please raise your hands high and keep your questions limited to 1, if at all possible. Thank you.
Take a little bit of lead in, but I know Mark has had experience with the present King Soopers facility that has a PIF, and it adjoins the dog track property. It's got a number of vacancies, some recent, some long-standing, and you're looking, and the panelists have brought up works in progress, things getting out the gate, and an idea of looking around both the metro area as to how a particular project idea, whether what will play in the long run. But sitting on the other side of Quebec, we have Cronky's property. We've got the city hall we're in. We've got the stadium, but nowhere to be seen as anything like the 600 to 750,000 square feet retail, office, whatever that was promised to happen as part of that. And as my understanding, as part of his MDA with his property, he has remaining some rights of first refusal on other kinds of development that might or might not occur. So what I'm wondering is, given some of those situations, what the likelihood is of this property nearby, presently occupied by the dog track structures, they're probably going to call for a scrape-off, as some of you have indicated, as opposed to bare ground sitting on this side of Quebec. What you see in looking at the possibilities of what's already there and what's being contemplated for here.
You want to take that?
Mark, I think you should answer that one.
Yeah. You own the King Soopers there, or you did the King Soopers.
I don't own the project any longer, but I think that the King Soopers project was a well-conceived project, and arguably that it's going to take some time for it to be, to realize this potential. But at least from my perspective, the King Soopers project will fit hand in glove with what happens to the dog track as ancillary retail to that property, which is really not much different than happened to other retail projects that were on the periphery, if you will, of Belmar and those sorts of projects. So I think one of the things that the panel said, and maybe others would weigh in on the question, real estate development is a long thing. After all, it has a notion of sustainability, and it takes changing dynamics to make those things happen. And I wouldn't say that the King Soopers project was perfectly conceived, but it wasn't ill-conceived either. But I think the dog track will only enhance the hand of that project.
I think the thing to remember is, with any redevelopment effort or development from a community standpoint, community development effort, is that it's long-term, and that right now every corner of Denver has got vacancies of retail property and office property. And we will continue to go through cyclical markets. What we've got to look at in community building is the longer term and what is needed to make this economy here in Commerce City strong for the long term. So those will be some of the things that'll need to be looked at. The issues you brought up are all solvable. It's just a matter of sitting down and figuring out how you want to try to do it and win.
Just one more comment. By the way, the King Soopers is doing better. Had that conversation with them a few days ago.
Hi, Mark. Thank you for doing this, and thank all of you. It's helpful to all of us in our community. There's no way you can pay a retailer to come in and put a store that's going to lose money in your community, no matter how good of a deal that you can have. Because of the demographics, because such a large portion of the area around the dog track is industrial and not residential, and because of the access not only at the median corner, but within a couple miles around, it's almost hard to get into downtown Commerce City for people that live in other areas. You all talked about retail. Do you see other problems, or do you know of other problems, particularly you, Ann, where retail isn't the objective of the project? Mm-hmm. Because quite frankly, I don't know that retail would be a good direction for that. Mm-hmm. and I'm sure that there's other problems with non-retail type redevelopments. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I honestly hope that retail isn't the focus of it, but I say that just from my independent opinion and not talking to the community. My bigger concerns, the obvious ones that Susan talked about, that can all be taken care of in terms of what improvements are there. A couple things, you mentioned the demographics, and I'll go back to what was talked about at Belmar. We did some of the original feasibility work for some of the loft projects in downtown Denver. No market existed. There wasn't a product that we could take trend data and say, oh, we're going to continue to grow by X number of units at these price points. So what you have to do is you have to look beyond the exact perimeter of the dog track, and you have to take a bigger look at the market and say, how I call it trajectory, but how far do we have to reach to attract a market for whatever our vision is? And then you improve the connections between those markets. Also, this project, because of all the things you said, is going to require some incredibly strong draw elements. Why there? It's going to have to be a place in the minds of people, unlike what it is today. That could be so many different things. I mean, that can be a great hotel that's willing to, take a chance early. It could be great community elements. It could be trails that connect up to your other civic uses, but that becomes like that major theme. The green development that happened at Stapleton, it's really fascinating. When you create a place, you can slice it so many ways. It's not just the physical buildings. It can be how you promote the place, or the mission behind the place, or whatever. So I truly believe that this will be one of those projects that will require that really think different kind of approach to it. And retail will be an amenity that services the other uses, the other reasons people come to that place. I firmly believe that.
That's well put. I agree with that vision as well.
Well, this doesn't have anything to do with the dog track, but just thinking about all the experience and the various urban renewal projects that you've all participated in across the board, I'm wondering, in Fort Collins, our urban renewal and economic health program have now just recently gone into an Office of Sustainability, and we're no longer under either finance or economic health as our own department. And so my question to you is, how has either lead requirements or sustainable green development that's either required or enforced on you positively or negatively influenced your ability to effectively do urban renewal?
Great question.
Well, I can speak to what we did at Belmar. It wasn't imposed on us, but frankly, we saw it, and that was sort of at the earlier stages of sustainability and lead development. And while we didn't think that we were necessarily going to get higher rents because of it, we thought it was going to make the project more easily marketed, that it was a sort of unique characteristic of it at the time, and I think now more an expected characteristic of improvements. And I think that helped to draw. We built 200,000 square feet of basically spec office in the first phase. And frankly, we had it all leased up by the time we opened. We were pleasantly surprised. But I think those components of it contributed to that ability to get it leased up. So I think, they're sort of hand in glove. There are certainly premiums associated with adding those components to a project, but you got to sort of factor those in. I think the urban renewal financing tools help offset some of those costs to the extent that they can pay some of the other infrastructure costs.
There's so much being going on in the whole sustainable thing right now as to cost benefit, and where that demand comes from. But we're certainly seeing, particularly in the residential areas, that in apartment living and that sort of thing, that there's a discriminating renter or buyer that wants a sustainable component to their house or their living quarters. And Dan just touched on the real interesting thing is in what we call exit strategies, selling real estate today. Sustainable elements of projects do demand higher values, but it's hard to. It's such a tactful thing to be able to measure the cost benefit going into the project. It's very difficult.
On that same note, I think the office, the residential, and even retail, everybody wants to be green, but I think the important component there is if you start down the road with a retailer, especially one of the larger format retailers, get a hold of their green group early.
Very fast.
Very fast, because if real estate gets in front of them, they're done. Because real estate will do what's easy, and they'll go run ahead, and they'll go build their 175,000-foot box, and then when you ask for something green, they'll throw some bike racks in.
But it is interesting, a lot of there is even in that component in large retailers today, a group in just about every one of them.
Yeah, they all have their group. They have to have it.
They're all conscious of green.
Correctness.
They are. It isn't that they're, and 5 years ago that wasn't the case.
Right.
I have one right here, and then we'll go to Roger and then Guillermo. There is a lot of talk, especially in the papers lately, about agriculture land and designating that as blighted for use of urban renewal. Can you talk about that and your opinions in regards to designating agriculture land as urban renewal area? And then due to some of the projects that are happening right now in the region, we anticipate a lot of legislative changes at the state legislature to urban renewal policy, specifically concerning agriculture land. Could you comment on any possible changes in the future that you anticipate the legislature debating?
Let me talk about the first part, and you talk about the legislature.
And I can talk about.
I'm probably the only outlier on this subject, and I'm willing to go on record this way. I mean, I've been doing this for almost 26 years, and I've seen the statute change during that time about 3 or 4 times. And the last statutory change was House Bill 1107 that took out, air quotes, took out the ability to do urban renewal projects on agriculturally assessed land, not zoned, agriculturally assessed. Most people don't know that. Except when that municipality was able to get the agreement, 100% of the agreement of all the impacted taxing entities. So when people jump on the Gaylord bandwagon, and I say this, I don't care about Gaylord. I don't care whether it gets built. That's not the question. The question is, was Aurora appropriate in finding that area blighted? According to the statute, absolutely they were. That was appropriate because the legislation changed to say you can make this finding of blight based on those 11 factors I told you about. And remember, 70 of the 11 have nothing to do with whether there's a structure there or not. But They then had to go the 100% mile, which is to go out to every tiny little taxing entity. You can have a taxing entity out there that has 1/10 of 1% of the land holdings, and if they say no, Aurora can't do the urban renewal plan, okay? That's how tight the legislation was this last time. And if they went out and got the approval of all those taxing entities, as the statute has recently been revised, then who are we to say that they can't do it? I mean, that is my opinion.
You know, I was actually involved in the discussions and the drafting of the changes to the urban renewal law in 2004. And I similarly have sort of strong opinions about just the process by which those things occur. I don't think anybody would disagree that the political process is one where sort of political correctness seems to dominate. You know, a particular idea comes in to get sort of political wind behind it. And it seems like, I think as Americans, we tend to sort of be this way. We overreact to things. We get really excited, we overreact to them, we sort of go too far, the pendulum swings back a little the other way. I think we have a difficult time sort of thinking about things carefully, thoughtfully, and in a considered way. And frankly, the legislators that I dealt with didn't have the first clue what that stuff meant, but it was a political hot potato at the time, and they wanted publicity for looking like they were doing something about it, notwithstanding the fact they didn't even understand the issue or frankly have a real interest in it. They saw some political mileage in sort of carrying that flag. And so, you know, at that time, they wanted to change the definition of blight. They wanted to make it more difficult to use condemnation powers. At the time, there was a municipality that was trying to use the condemnation powers to undertake a project that, frankly, they wouldn't have been allowed to do, and there was a Supreme Court decision that had nothing to do with any changes in the law. It said, you can't do that. And so the law protected and prevented that abuse from happening. And so there was no need to change the law. And then there was a decision that came down in Connecticut where the Supreme Court decided that you can use that public use, that solely economic purposes is an appropriate public use. And frankly, I agree with that. Now, that's sort of politically unpalatable to say these days, and so the statute was then changed again, and I was involved in those discussions to no longer allow the economic components to be the driving factor, or frankly, even be a factor. Well, that's ridiculous. It's obviously a factor. I mean, when you have an area that's blighted, whether it's what you would traditionally think of as blighted or just because it meets the technical definition. I mean, Belmar, for example, it was at the end of its physical and economic life. It's functional obsolescence. There's clearly an economic component to it. Now, you know, I think what people might get exercised about is, well, you're going to, you know, close the bike store so you can put Walmart in there. Okay, well, that's a closer question. But that doesn't mean that considering sort of the economic impact is not relevant. It is relevant. And so I think the changes in legislation are overreactions, and it makes it more difficult. There aren't many economic development tools in the state. Frankly, that's one of them. You know, when times are a little better, people are, and I think, you know, in politics, people tend to sort of beat on those and try to whittle them back. In less favorable economic times, they sort of bemoan, well, there really aren't tools to do these things. Well, it's because you abused the tools and you limited them and you eliminated them at the times when they were sort of politically expedient to eliminate. And so I think, you know, we don't tend to be as thoughtful about these things as we probably ought to. It doesn't mean that we should be insensitive to the issues and challenges that they present. I think we need to be thoughtful about these things. But I think they tend to get driven by political expediency.
Let me just add, Westminster did put some property that was farmed. Where the orchard is now was agricultural land, and we put it into urban renewal. It did meet the findings of blight. I can't remember what they were. But more significantly, what I wanted to mention, and you touched on it, is that we don't have many tools to use, and urban renewal is one of those financing tools that we have. And what we did is worked with Adams County. We worked with the school district. We talked through how we were going to do the project, what we needed to do. We used urban renewal to handle 2 interchanges. The reason why we had to build the interchanges because the state government didn't have the funds to build those interchanges. The only way we were able to build 144th and 136 was using urban renewal powers and authorities to go ahead and establish the bonding authority or the authority to issue bonds to finance those projects. So that's, you know, you look at that greenfield and you go, well, what's blighted about it? Well, for 144th and 136th, the big blight was that there was no access. You know, as far as being able to make development occur in that area. What were we able to do? We were able to go from having agricultural land that was assessed at a very low revenue to one now that is at a commercial level and is generating enough revenue from property tax alone to pay off the bonds that we issued initially.
As I see it, there's always been 2 traditional problems with the tools. One is the word urban renewal, meaning that only the city of Denver probably has it. That's one problem, and by the way, one of the blind sides of the legislature. The second, blight. You know, it is an economic tool, as the panelists talk, but the legislature does focus on those 2 things.
And we're going to take 2 more questions, one from Roger, one from Mo, and then we will head out.
Quick question, chicken and egg type of question, and it's really aimed at Ann. When are you the most effective in doing your analysis? So say we have our strategy, we've talked to other developers, we have lots of good ideas, we think we know what will possibly work. Is that the time to bring you in, or do we actually marry a developer and then bring you in after that as marriage counselor?
Yeah, I know exactly where, from lots of years of experience, I know exactly when to get out of the way, and I know, so I can answer this question. Very early on in bringing the market, matching up the market reality with the community expectations, that education process, getting council ready for the 30% gap discussion so that they're not stunned when it comes, because it's coming. And knowing that there's different ways to look at your return on investment. So that early stage, working iteratively, but to a lesser extent with the design community as the master plan, you know, informing that, but being there to make sure that there's financial feasibility to what's being designed and discussed, and that. Then you go out and solicit the developer, and what we usually say is we want to be there for the first catalyst project, because that's where we can make sure you're holding up those policies that you've set out for the master plan, where we're there to review the first pro forma and say, is this reasonable? They need a 15% return or whatever. Yeah, that's okay, because this is what the project's bringing. And then you've got the tools, and then we kind of let you go. We were working for the city of Fort Worth several years ago doing a central city revitalization strategy, and we had to deal with 10 villages around the downtown area, and it took us 2 years doing this exact same thing. And we were there for, I remember at the interview they said, so after you finish the market strategy, do you just go away? And my partner joked and said, heck no, we want to get on the payroll. But really what that meant was being there for those first few projects, which we were. They said you have to be here while the dirt's turning on the first few projects. So we did that. Then we stepped away, and we come back, and we've been doing this for 9 years. We go back every year and do a report card. And that report card, that's another one of those things I have to leave you with. That's what gets you that gentleman who has that house saying, you're making good progress. I might not see 10 buildings up there, or I was promised 100,000 square feet of office, but you're telling the story. It's the worst thing the cities do. They go out and ask for political support, and then they get so busy doing their job, they forget to touch base with the community and say, we've made progress. We've changed our regulations. We've got this much in our TIF. We've got this, and all of that's leading up to things that'll become more visible. So that we're at the beginning, a little bit, and then we're way at the end after you're already moving and grooving.
And her involvement adds credibility to your efforts to go chase down the right guys.
Absolutely. One more question.
Guillermo Serna. From your experience in condemning and all this type of stuff, if a city is going through an attack of fracking, would that be considered enough to blight the whole city?
That is such a loaded question.
From your yours,
You know, fracking
we're
hasn't- yeah.
we're surrounded by highways.
I know.
We got the arsenal, and now blighting comes around through no fault of our own. But there's a lot in Commerce City and a lot in Adams County. Now that puts us in one, as a city, very stressful in getting companies to come in to participate with us in urban renewal and all this type of stuff. So is it possible to get something like that done so we can continue growing the way we should be and the way it was planned when the airport was built?
Is your fear or your concern, is it specifically what the perception that the fracking might be having on your community and the perceptions by the development community?
Especially, yes.
Okay.
And you know, it's hard to sell a home if you got fracking right next door.
Yeah. You know, I'm way out on a limb on this one, but I really believe that fracking, like urban renewal's been around. Actually, the earliest legislation in the state of Colorado was in 1957, but it really came to fruition in the early 1970s. And even 50 years later, there's still not enough education out there. There's still a lot of misinformation. Fracking in Colorado's been around since 1943. I learned a lesson early in my life. My father was a nuclear engineer, and his company went into 3 Mile Island the day after the accident to put in a cooling system. And I remember, I was young, but he told me, he said there were 3 public relations people working at 3 Mile Island the day before the accident, and there were 27 the day after. And he said it was the biggest mistake the nuclear energy industry ever made. And you know, I can tell you, me, as just me and my experience, that fracking doesn't scare me, but I also believe that somebody out there has to be doing more education, that somebody like a developer can say, be assured it doesn't scare me, so that you know that your community is being taken care of the right way. I think that this issue just needs to be talked about, and people need to come with calm minds and really listen. But it truly has been, since 1943 it's been going on, and now it's getting talked about, and somehow somebody didn't do their homework to address the concern up front. But me and Ricker personally, it doesn't concern me for your community, but that's me.
And
Well-
so you can go walk out of here and feel good about what you've got today. I'm fully aware of it, and I'm working on a project in Commerce City, and it doesn't bother me in the least. It doesn't bother my client in the least, and my client is a very, very well-to-do client. It doesn't bother them at all. They believe that there are customers here, those customers are not being serviced, and that they have an opportunity to bring goods and services, and the community will respond in kind.
Well, Davis, Susan, Dan, Ann, and Greg, thank you so much for doing this, and really want to offer my appreciation for coming this evening in Commerce City. So, hand it off.
And I would just like to thank our moderator, Mark Goldberg, tonight. You did a great job, as well as our panelists. And last but not least, I do want to thank Julie Jacoby on the Commerce City Economic Development staff. Julie is our retail specialist, and she did everything to make this event tonight happen and a success. So thank you very much, Julie. And thanks to all of you, because we're running past 8 o'clock. So thank you for spending time with us, and we hope to see you at the next ICSC Alliance Roadshow.
I was waiting for you, actually. I knew you were gonna get me somewhere.
How you feeling?